So we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome everyone. My name is Eric Shanak, and this is my partner, Erica Prosser, and together we make Philanthropy Playmakers. We're here to discuss today the art of sports nonprofit storytelling. So right now we have you all muted. We have a few questions throughout our webinar. We'll talk for about 15, 20 minutes, right around that 20-minute mark. And then we're gonna open it up for questions. So feel free to use the chat, feel free to provide any comments or ask questions throughout that, and we'll monitor it as well. But without further ado, we will start chatting about storytelling. So we know now more than ever the importance of storytelling, and especially turning those stories into additional donors and additional dollars. Storytelling evokes emotion. It brings about connections between strangers and people that know each other. Storytelling humanizes an organization, and a mission. And more importantly, it tears down walls and allows you to peek behind the curtain of what really goes on with that organization. And then most importantly, storytelling is that emotional hook. We know that emotional people are more susceptible and more willing to give to organizations. And so from our perspective, it's really about making sure that the story is incredibly emotional so that we can leverage that feeling and that emotion and increase the donors' engagement as well as the dollars that will come. So storytelling used to look like this. It was this annual uh, report that would come in the mail, or they'd sometimes put it online, and it was the main vehicle for storytelling. Now, don't get me wrong, this has a place in society, and a lot of organizations still use this effectively. However, it shouldn't be the main or only form of storytelling. We see these online, now sometimes they come out even quarterly. And once again, there's an audience that is really receptive to this form of storytelling. However, in 2020, storytelling looks a little differently. So on the left-hand side here, you have The Last Dance, which is a documentary about a team that last played together 22 years ago. On the right-hand side, you have a video on TikTok from the World Health Organization asking people to nominate their hero using a hashtag. And these are two totally different organizations, two different ways to storytell, two different insights, and two different ways in. However, they're both incredibly successful and powerful at storytelling because they have one thing in common, which is a central, compelling character. We'll talk about that later, but just remember that as we continue throughout this conversation. So we do want to talk about what storytelling looks like in today's environment. Don't get me wrong, there's rarely perfect times to be asking for funds or to be storytelling. We have natural disasters, we have recessions, we have pandemics. Each one's a little different. And so we really wanted to focus on this, what we're calling a hierarchy of needs in terms of how to determine what kind of story to tell during COVID. So the first stage is safety and control. Supporters want to know what's changing and what's safe in this new reality. So if you think back to middle of March, we were inundated with emails from our airline, our beauty supply, our car dealership, our favorite hair supplier, you name it. We were probably surprised by how many emails we were signed up for. And that was when everyone was like, man, everyone and their mother is emailing me. The second stage is connection. Supporters want to feel like we're all in this together. And so if you think back to recent TV commercials that you've seen, I would be willing to bet that a lot of them focused on our frontliners, thanking our heroes. They had the same piano music, they had the same end lines and key phrases, and that makes sense. We're all trying to bring people together, even when we're physically apart. However, it's really tough to break through the clutter, so much so that there were spoofs on YouTube and all other channels saying how all campaigns and all ads are the same. The third stage is assistance. And supporters are saying, I need help and I need it fast because this is getting really hard. We weren't sure if this was going to last 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months. And so now that we know that it's really more of uh, a disruption rather than an interruption, we know that supporters are looking for help because this is the new normal. And then finally, the fourth stage is recovery. And supporters are saying, I need to feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel, that we're going to get through this and we'll be okay on the other side. So I'm going to pause here. Where do you guys think we are in this hierarchy of needs? Are we on stage 1, 2, 3, or 4? And feel free to just answer in the chat. So a couple people thinking we're in recovery, a few saying it depends. The fact is, the easy answer is yes, it depends. We would say that we're sitting in assistance. And this is, we recently came out of Connection. If you look at TV, for example, we don't have as many of those thank you ads as we did in all of April and the beginning of May. But the assistance stage is really important for nonprofits because this is where we can raise our hand and say, we can help, and here's how. So for example, we know that communities like minority communities, the LGBT community, the youth community, and the service industry have all been they've been hit hard by COVID. And so rather than say, as a nonprofit, we need help because we need to continue to do our work, let's flip the script and actually say, we impact these communities. We know that they've been hit hard by COVID. And so by helping us, we can actually help the communities just as much as any other nonprofit that is working right now during COVID. And I know there's a lot of questions of, well, we're not a food bank or we're not a relief fund. The beauty is, though, is that we can still help, and we are an essential industry that is helping in these communities. And so, for example, we know that a lot of kids aren't getting normal exercise. They're home, they're not playing their youth sports. So if we as an organization can help there, and we're saying that we're providing that exercise, we're just as important as the food banks. And so while we're sitting in this assistance stage, we do need to be forward thinking and look towards recovery. Remember that it's going to take time and it's not going to be the same case for everyone. But if we can plan our stories for recovery while we're in the assistance stage, we'll be able to hit the ground running once we reach that stage. And so there's really 3 things that we want you to take away around storytelling during COVID. The first is to meet donors where they are. The second is to contextualize the story within the current setting. And the third is to remember that you can ask for money. So some donors have been impacted and some haven't. Remember, they may be living in a different part of the country where restrictions are up, or maybe the restrictions are still in place. Some donors may not really feel any impact at all. And so you need to be able to have those honest conversations and tell your story and frame it within our current environment. Make sure that it's positioned as our organization is impacting these communities and these audiences. And then remember, you can ask for money, and you really should ask for money, because otherwise they're not quite sure what the end result will be for your story. So don't be bashful about asking for money when your mission is critical during this time period. So now that we know what storytelling can look like during COVID, we want to talk about the 3 steps to tell a good story that ultimately will increase donors and drive dollars for your organization. And this is true during COVID as well as in a post-COVID world. The first step is to set an intention. what do you want this story to do for you? The second step is to identify the audience. Who are you trying to target? Is it current donors? Is it prospective donors? Or is it someone completely different? And then once you've answered those two questions, the third step is to craft the story and have a call to action that is appropriate for those first two buckets. And so I am going to pass it off to Erica to take us through these steps.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I was not sure if I am unmuted. Yes? Can you hear me? You might need to unmute me. Oh, Benay can. Great. Okay. So first step, we've got set an intention as, thank you everybody for the feedback. Okay, so this is a pretty standard fundraising funnel. It's a one we use in sales, but we've adapted it for our purposes here, which is fundraising. When we tell stories, we are aiming at this bigger population of potential supporters. Some of these people have never heard of you before. Others do follow you and do engage, but they don't show support beyond just that. The reality is that nonprofits are really great at this awareness piece. They know their mission and their programs. They push out content on their social media and newsletters, and a lot of that is giving updates about programming and other announcements. And right now, even in this current climate, they're using their social media platforms to engage with their beneficiaries. So we've got the awareness piece locked down. The problem is that many nonprofits don't do a good enough job of moving people through this funnel from awareness to engagement and then on to support. And there's one major reason for this, and Eric already touched on it, but it's that the stories being shared, if they are being shared, don't have a call to action. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, but you really have to set an intention for every story that you collect and write and put out into the world. Today, we're talking about turning stories into dollars, and therefore our intention for our stories is raising money. And that might seem obvious, but it's really important that everyone who is writing and communicating stories know that the intention is creating awareness, or the intention is creating fundraising opportunities. So we have an example to share just to give some color to what we're teaching. We're going to pretend that I run a nonprofit that donates sports equipment to kids in need. So the intention for my story is going to be, I want to ask for donations to support expansion into a new neighborhood. Okay, step 2, we need to identify the audience. First, who is your audience? It's not enough to just say, oh, my audience is my current donors, or my audience is everyone in the world because I want everyone to know about my mission. And while that's true, and we hope that everyone can learn about your mission, it's just not effective in storytelling. It's really critical, especially when you're trying to tell fundraising stories, that you narrow down and really drill down into a specific audience, a specific segment of your base. So who are you telling your story to? In our example, there's a lot of different people we could target with a nonprofit campaign to raise money for sporting equipment. But we want to pick one kind of supporter. So for us, we're going to say that our target is a former high school athlete who's come from an at-risk community who is now in a full-time job. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, how do I even figure that out? But through your storytelling, constantly communicating with your donors and stewarding this, which we're going to get into, you're going to become more familiar with your base and who is listening to your stories. So that's our target audience. People in the room who are Gen X, they recognize the power of sport to change lives because presumably sport changed their lives for the better. So we have an audience in mind, and now we have to figure out, where is that audience? I just said Gen X. Well, I know through my research that Gen X hangs out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I also know that they read their emails and they sign up for newsletters. And I also know that they would attend events or online virtual events as well. So I need to be using all of those platforms to tell my story in different ways. Because I think a lot of times we get caught up with platform only means social media, and that's just not true. We've got, of course, social, but we also have our newsletter list. We have virtual meetings. There's your website that you need to maintain. There's also just good old-fashioned phone calls and letter writing, which does still work for a large segment of donors. So that's our step number 2. We've set the intention. Now we've identified where we need to be telling our story. And then the last piece here is to actually craft your story. So again, Eric mentioned this earlier, but the one thing that The Last Dance and the WHO's campaign had in common is that they both centered on a single person, one single compelling character. And storytelling is all about this one compelling character, because that is how you produce the emotion that makes people willing and wanting to give. They're very different. The Last Dance documentary versus a TikTok campaign, very different, but it's this one thing that they have in common. For example, in The Last Dance, I'm sure a lot of you noticed that they didn't call Obama former president, they called him former Chicago resident, because they were intentional about weaving their entire storyline back to their single character, who of course is Michael Jordan. So that was just a really great example of what we mean when we say to focus on a single person. I do want to hang out here for just a second, because it's really important that you understand how powerful this can be. For example, this is the kind of photo we see on a lot of sports nonprofit Instagram pages and even in newsletters and whatnot. It's cute. These kids are adorable. But if I'm honest, if I'm scrolling through and I see this picture and I see a caption that's like, had a great day teaching fundamentals and leadership to 50 kids. I might say, okay, that's great, but I'm probably going to keep scrolling. On the other hand, if I see a picture like this cute kid, of course it helps that he's cute, but it forces me to pay attention, because I know there's only one thing I need to be looking at in this photo. And I'm using photos to illustrate this example, but the same goes for written stories, for stories you communicate orally at events, virtually or in person, and even in person one-on-one donor conversations. If you can tell the story of this one child, either through words or pictures, you're going to have a better emotional connection. And again, that emotion equals more support. So that's our compelling character. In our example of sports nonprofit that's giving away sports equipment, we have a main character. We're going to call him Johnny. Okay, Johnny he comes from an at-risk neighborhood, and he needs new basketball shoes. Okay, so that takes us into the second piece here, is identifying right away what the issue or the conflict is with our compelling character, Johnny. The issue here is he needs new shoes to keep playing basketball. That's not enough, though. You have to create some sort of urgency, or again, the magic word emotion, around this story. And to do that, you have to draw the connection between basketball shoes and a better life for Johnny. And how do you do that? Well, you have to explain through your storytelling that basketball shoes, sure, it keeps him in the sport, and that's great, and we all believe in the power of sport, but you need to tell your donors and explain to people who might not see the immediate connection that keeping Johnny in sports is actually keeping him out of trouble, and it's keeping him motivated in school, and therefore he's set up for a future that maybe his older brother or older cousins didn't have because of their circumstance. And so you're communicating through your through your storytelling methodology that one pair of shoes actually saves Johnny's life. And not only that, but it could change the trajectory of his entire family. Our next piece in the craft your story is the resolution. So for our story, the resolution is we are able to provide shoes to Johnny, not only one time, but every year that he grows out of shoes, he can come back to us to get new shoes that fit him until he's at a point where he can buy his own shoes. That's a happy resolution. It's positive. It shows that we are providing a solution to Johnny's situation. It's important to note, though, that resolution in this sense doesn't have to be positive. It can also be negative. This is what would happen to Johnny if he didn't have our support, if he didn't get a new pair of basketball shoes. And finally, again, we've mentioned this several times, but it's really important that you add a call to action to your story. People need to be directed, okay? It's not enough anymore. I mean, think about your social media habits. It's not enough to just post a picture and assume people are gonna engage with it, because we're inundated all day long with content, and we need to actually direct people and not be shy about say, hey, I need you to donate, or I need you to share this post, or I need you to submit pictures, whatever your call to action is to either raise awareness, engagement, or support. So this is your story structure, and the structures of stories have never changed. You know, this is a tried and true method. The creativity comes in with you all identifying characters that you want to share their stories, and there's lots of different stories to be told. A story that I tell to my Gen X audience is going to be different than a story I tell to a baby boomer or somebody who is a family member of a beneficiary or a potential beneficiary. And even a step further, grant narratives, board reports, formal communications, they involve more than just a compelling character, of course, but this is a tried and true method for really stirring that emotion. So our key takeaways. Meet donors where they are in the current climate. Eric touched on where we are with COVID-19 right now. And again, there's always going to be a current climate to take into consideration. Secondly, identify, oh, so sorry. Can you go back for me, Eric? You want to identify your audience and steward your stories. Stewarding your stories sounds like a fancy way of saying just keep engaging. If you put a story out onto a platform or you email, you want to follow up. If people share your story, thank them. If people respond to your email, respond. That seems really simple, but we get caught up in so much of the automation of running a business and a nonprofit that we forget that the emotion, the connection is going to lead you to more support, which is in fact the third bullet here. Emotional stories equals more support. You get the emotional stories because you're identifying one single person to humanize that mission and to really help people who might just be followers or might not have heard of you to buy into what you're doing to change your communities. Do we have any questions? You can submit those in the chat and we're happy to respond. No questions must mean that we did a really great job of explaining. Okay. Oh, Casey has a question. Yes.
If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and we can you can ask it over the webinar.
Okay, I see a question in the chat that is there any advice for using platforms like social versus email versus other mediums, and what works best? So the one thing that I really do encourage is that people use email consistently to connect with their donor bases. Why do I say that? Because you have control of that list. We are at the mercy of Mark Zuckerberg when it comes to our social media followers, and that team can mess with the algorithm so much that what you're putting out, not only might not get there to in front of your followers' eyes, but it also disappears so quickly, right? We know for sure that when you send an email to somebody, it ends up in their email box. Might end up in their spam. They might say they never got it, but most times it's going to end up in their email. And so I think that is a communication platform that we really need to leverage more and more. And again, the other part is the age of the people you're trying to talk to. Eric, I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I would also just add that social allows you to reach so many more people than email. So not to contradict that, but it's really it goes back to what is the intention of that story. So if you want to bring in new people and potentially reach others that aren't donors or that aren't on your email, social may be the way to go. Now, to combat what Erica was saying, you may have to put some paid support behind your social media so that you're guaranteed to reach a certain audience and that it's not suppressed by the algorithms. So I would go back to what is that intention there, and then try to identify the best social platform if that's the direction you go. I would also add that it probably isn't an either or, it's an and strategy. So if you want to, email is great for consistency, but you should absolutely sprinkle in social and sometimes even sprinkle in paid social, because then you're guaranteed to get eyeballs versus, like Erica said, it just completely disappearing. I have a great example of someone who does some work in a controversial area. And so when he shares his content, sometimes it is suppressed. He has 15,000 Instagram followers and only 700 people see it. I mean, that doesn't make sense based on the numbers. So the platform is suppressing that content.
We have another question from Kelly. We're celebrating an anniversary and we want to tell the history of our organization, not ask for gifts. What would your call to action suggestion be? Eric, do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think the easiest one is to share the story, right? It doesn't have to be, we need your support, but you do want to tell your story not only to the people who are familiar with you, but to others. So it's as simple as say, hey, share this with your networks, or comment below if it's a social media post, or you could even ask for your readers' input. If you send it out via email, you could say, hey, could you respond back with a story of your own about how our organization has impacted you or someone you know? Or, hey, why do you follow us? You're a part of our history. Why are you here? Why do you support us? Why do you follow us? And it integrates their story into your story. And again, it's going to create more of a connection there.
I would also just add, so I used to work at St. Jude, and we would tell a lot of awareness type stories and not necessarily be asking for gifts. And if you're looking at an anniversary, maybe you look back and you say, okay, where were we, at inception? So when we were at St. Jude, we'd say when our doors opened, the overall survival rate was 20%. Now it's 80% for childhood cancer. So can you weave in some of those talking points that you normally, not that they're throwaways, they're important points, but sometimes they're not the most emotional. Can you weave those in to your story in an emotional way? So by saying, 4 out of 5 kids survive childhood cancer, but 1 out of 5 doesn't, and that's unacceptable. We can't let 1 child out of 5 pass away. We've now talked about where we were when we opened our doors, where we are on our anniversary, and have that urgency and call to action, of whether it's awareness or, in that case, it may be a gift. So all that to be said is like, what are your talking points and things that you can hit home on over the course of the last year or 5 years or however long it's been, so that you can show the progress that you've made as well?
Got one, maybe time for one more here. How to tell a story as a stewardship action, thanking a donor for a gift, but not asking again right away. I think this is a similar kind of concept that you can get creative with your call to action. Something I really love to see is when beneficiaries themselves tell their own story or thank donors on behalf of the organization. There's, of course, a tasteful way to do that, to involve youth or families so that they feel seen but not used. But I think that it's really great if you can have a personal touch in that sense. And the story kind of tells itself that way if you do involve people who are directly benefiting from your work as part of the stewardship process. Anything to add, Eric?
No, well said.
Yes, so we will be sharing, yes, we've recorded this entire message, and we will share that with you. Eric, do you also want to touch on reviewing stories?
Yeah, so we thought that there's a lot of information in here. We know we flew by it very quickly. And so if we want to make the offer that if anyone wants to write stories, take a stab at anything really storytelling related in this deck, we'd be happy to set up time outside of this to review one-on-one either your story or the problem you're having and the best ways to help tell that story and bring it to life. Whether that is for awareness, donation, engagement, you name it. So we are happy to do that. So like Erica said, we'll be sharing out the slideshow cost-free. We'll be doing it. We just want to provide some added value. And so feel free to email us. I think you have my email, which is shaynock@philanthropyplaymakers.com. But feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to set up time to review any stories that you guys put together. So that was short and sweet. If you guys have other questions that you think of as well, obviously feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to hop on a call or help however we can. So hopefully you guys found this valuable, and if you guys, like I said, other questions or you want to connect with the people on the webinar, we'd be happy to help make those connections however we can.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.